51 degrees, 19 minutes south, 60 degrees, 58 minutes west. A grass airstrip cut into the peat of West Falklands' northern coast, separated from the main island by a stretch of water no wider than the Solent. The settlement at Pebble Island had been founded in 1846 as a sheep station, and by the spring of 1982 it counted 25 permanent residents, roughly 6,000 sheep, and one improvised military airfield that the Royal Navy considered an unacceptable threat to the forthcoming amphibious landings. The strip itself measured some 700 meters in length, oriented roughly east to west, with a parallel taxiway pressed into the turf by Argentine engineers in the second week of April. Northwood's intelligence cell, working from imagery passed through Defence Intelligence staff at the old War Office building on Whitehall, had logged the airfield as Target Pebble on the 4th of May. The concern was straightforward and tactical. Pucarás ground attack aircraft operating from the strip could reach the proposed San Carlos landing area in under 20 minutes flying time, and they could do so beneath the radar horizon of the Type 965 air search sets fitted to the Type 42 destroyers screening the carrier battle group. Rear Admiral Sandy Woodward, flying his flag in HMS Hermes, recorded in his command diary that the Pebble Island problem had been raised at every morning prayers since the carriers had crossed the total exclusion zone boundary on the 30th of April. The Admiral wanted the strip neutralized before the amphibious force, designated Task Group 317.0, closed the islands. His staff calculated that even 4 serviceable Pucarás, each carrying 2 Mark 81 general-purpose bombs and a centerline gun pod of 7.62 mm Browning machine guns, could inflict catastrophic damage on a landing craft utility moving across the open water of Falkland Sound. The signal traffic between Hermes and the Commander-in-Chief Fleet at Northwood, declassified in 2012 under the 30-year rule, shows a sharpening tone through the first week of May. On the 2nd of May, Conqueror sank the General Belgrano. On the 4th, Sheffield was struck by an exocet fired from a super-étendard of the Argentine naval aviation. The loss of Sheffield, with 20 of her ship's company killed, transformed Woodward's risk calculus. Every Argentine airframe within striking distance of the fleet now represented an existential threat to the operation, and Pebble Island held, by that stage, 11 of them. Imagery analysis confirmed the count: 6 FMAIA-58 Pucarás, twin-engined ground attack aircraft, 4 T-34C Turbo-Mentor armed trainers operated by the Argentine Navy's 1st Naval Air Attack Squadron, and a single short SC-7 Skyvan transport, the last of these used for resupply runs between the Strip and Puerto Argentino. The Pucarás carried the markings of Grupo de Ataque 3, redeployed from their peacetime base at Reconquista in Santa Fe province. Their pilots had reached the Falklands on the 29th of April aboard a Hercules from Comodoro Rivadavia, with their aircraft following in pairs the same week. The decision to commit Special Air Service troops to the destruction of the airfield was taken at a meeting in the Commander-in-Chief Fleet's bunker on the 8th of May, attended by Admiral Sir John Fieldhouse, Brigadier Peter de la Billière as Director SAS, and a representative from the Cabinet Office Overseas and Defence Secretariat. The minutes record only that the operation was approved in principle, subject to satisfactory close target reconnaissance. The signal authorizing the raid left Northwood at 2200 Zulu the same evening. The Argentine garrison on Pebble Island had not been intended as a permanent installation. The original plan, approved by the military junta in Buenos Aires in late April, had envisaged the strip as a forward operating base for naval aviation and an early warning post for any British approach from the north or west. The detachment that arrived on the 24th of April numbered some 114 men, drawn principally from the Argentine Marine Corps and the Naval Aviation Command structure. Command of the airfield itself fell to Capitán de Corbeta, Roberto Esteban, a 38-year-old naval officer whose previous posting had been instructing at the Escuela de Aviación Naval at Punta Indio. Esteban controlled the flying element, designated Estación Aeronaval Calderón after the small bay on the island's southern shore. Below him, in command of the ground defense force, stood Teniente de Navío Marega, leading a reinforced platoon of 38 men drawn from the Buzo Táctico, the Argentine Navy's tactical divers and amphibious commandos. The Buzo Táctico were, on paper, an elite formation, having trained extensively with United States Navy SEAL instructors during the 1970s and with Italian Comsubin frogmen at La Spezia. The reality on the ground proved less impressive. The Buzo Táctico had been deployed to Pebble Island without their full complement of communications equipment, and their FN-FAL rifles, manufactured under license at the Fábrica Militar at Rosario, had been issued with mixed batches of ammunition that produced inconsistent muzzle velocities. The detachment's two 81mm mortars had been positioned in a pit some 400 meters east of the settlement, but the crews had registered no defensive fire tasks because the gunnery officer assigned to the position had been recalled to Stanley on the 30th of April and not replaced. Argentine signal traffic, intercepted by the Composite Signals Organization station at two boats on Ascension Island and later analyzed at GCHQ Cheltenham, revealed a deteriorating logistical picture through the first week of May. On the 6th of May, Esteban requested an additional 30,000 rounds of 7.62mm NATO ammunition, replacement batteries for his SEM 25 man-portable radios, and 12 sets of British Army-issue Arctic clothing, the latter to be drawn from stocks captured at Government House on the 2nd of April. The signal, transmitted in a low-grade naval cipher that the Royal Navy had been reading since the Beagle Channel crisis of 1978, was logged at Cheltenham at 0400 Zulu and forwarded to Northwood within the hour. Esteban's reporting to the Comando de la Aviación Naval at Puerto Belgrano was, by his own later admission to the Argentine Board of Inquiry convened in 1983, optimistic to the point of self-deception. His situation reports through the second week of May described the perimeter as secured and the airfield as operationally ready. Neither claim withstood scrutiny. The perimeter consisted of 3 two-man observation posts, 2 of them facing south towards Falklands Sound and the third facing east towards the settlement. The northern and western approaches, which faced the open sea and the rocky foreshore, were covered only by roving patrols conducted twice nightly by sections of 4 men. The Pucarás pilots themselves, billeted in the settlement manager's house and 2 outlying buildings, maintained a flying program that consumed roughly 4,000 litres of aviation kerosene per day. Their dispersal was tactical in name only. The 11 aircraft sat in a loose row along the northern edge of the strip, their wings sometimes overlapping. The decision had been taken to ease the burden on the single ground crew detachment, which numbered 11 mechanics for 11 airframes. It would prove, on the night of the 14th, a fatal economy. The warning order reached D Squadron, 22nd Special Air Service Regiment, at 0700 Zulu on the 9th of May, transmitted from Northwood through the Hermes communications suite to the squadron commander, Major Cedric Delves. Delves had taken his squadron south aboard the carrier as part of the Land Forces element under Brigadier Julian Thompson's 3 Commando Brigade, but the Special Air Service answered to its own chain of command, running through Director SAS at the Duke of York's headquarters in Chelsea, and thence to the Commander-in-Chief Fleet. Delves convened his orders group in the squadron's compartment on Hermes's 3-deck, a space measuring some 15 feet by 20, its bulkheads hung with maps of the Falkland archipelago, and aerial photography passed down from the Joint Air Reconnaissance Intelligence Centre at RAF Brampton. The squadron's 4 troops were represented. Mountain Troop, commanded by Captain John Hamilton, specialised in winter and Arctic operations and had completed the long Norway exercise cycle 3 months earlier. Boat Troop, under Captain Christopher Brown, held the squadron's amphibious skills, including small boat handling and combat swimming. Air Troop and Mobility Troop made up the remainder. The initial proposal, drafted by Delves and his squadron sergeant major during the morning watch, called for the entire squadron to land on Pebble Island and to destroy not only the aircraft but also the ammunition dumps, the fuel bowsers, and the garrison itself. The plan envisaged a 4-phase assault running from approximately 2300 local time through to first light, with extraction by Sea King helicopters of 846 Naval Air Squadron from Hermes. The estimated friendly casualty figure, calculated by the squadron's intelligence sergeant using the standard British Army planning ratios for a deliberate attack against a defended position, was 9 killed and 20 wounded. Admiral Woodward refused the plan within 30 minutes of receiving it. His reasoning, recorded in the Daily Command Summary, now held at the National Archives in Kew under reference ADM 234/635, was operational rather than humanitarian. Hermes carried only a finite number of trained Special Air Service troopers in theatre. The Pebble Island raid was a means to an end, the end being the safe landing of 3 Commando Brigade at San Carlos. A squadron-level engagement that produced casualties on the scale of a deliberate company attack would deplete the Special Forces resource available for subsequent tasks, including the strategic reconnaissance of the East Falkland Mountains and the deception operations planned for the night of the landings themselves. The revised plan, submitted by Delves at 1600 Zulu the same day, restricted the assault to 45 men drawn principally from Mountain Troop and Boat Troop, with a small headquarters element and a naval gunfire support team attached. The objective was narrowed to the destruction of the 11 aircraft. The garrison was to be engaged only as required to secure the assault force's freedom of action on the strip itself. Extraction would take place no later than 90 minutes after the first explosion, regardless of how much of the airfield's ancillary equipment remained intact. The squadron's preparations followed the standard pattern established at Stirling Lines, the regimental headquarters at Hereford. Each man drew his personal weapon, the M16A1 rifle in preference to the SLR for its lighter weight, together with bandoliers of 5.56mm ammunition, M79 grenade launchers for selected pairs, and the standard issue 36 pattern fragmentation grenade. The demolition stores, however, were specialist. 2 pounds of plastic explosive per aircraft, primed with 30-second time delay fuses, had been requested from the Hermes Armoury on the 9th of May. The reconnaissance phase began at 0100 Zulu on the 11th of May, 4 nights before the planned assault. A patrol of 8 men from Boat Troop, commanded by Captain Brown, was lifted from Hermes by a single Sea King Mark IV of 846 Naval Air Squadron, piloted by Lieutenant Commander Simon Thornwell. The carrier was steaming some 100 nautical miles northeast of the Falklands at the time, well outside the published Argentine air search radius, but close enough that the helicopter's transit, conducted at 100 feet above the wave tops on passive navigation, consumed nearly the entire fuel load of the Mark IV's two Rolls-Royce Gnome H-1400 turboshafts. The insertion point lay on the northern shore of West Falkland, some 30 kilometers southeast of Pebble Island across Phillips Cove. Brown's men carried 4 Klepper Arias, 2 collapsible canoes, each capable of taking 2 paddlers and roughly 80 kilograms of equipment. The Klepper had been the standard British military canoe since the Special Boat Service had adopted it in the late 1950s, its rubberized cotton skin stretched over a frame of birch and ash. In the conditions of the South Atlantic in May, with sea temperatures recorded at 4 degrees Celsius and winds gusting to force 7 from the southwest, the canoes provided a marginal but workable means of crossing. The patrol established a hide on a feature-designated First Mountain, a low rise of peat and rock approximately 2.5 kilometers south of the airfield. From this position, using the Special Forces issue Dove in optical CB66 observation telescope and the smaller M19 binocular, Brown and his men maintained a continuous watch on the strip throughout the daylight hours of the 11th, 12th, and 13th of May. Their reports, transmitted in burst transmission on the PRC 319 high-frequency radio at preset windows, reached the squadron tactical headquarters on Hermes within minutes of being keyed. The intelligence picture that emerged was, in the recollection of the squadron's intelligence sergeant given to author Mark Urban for his 1995 history of the regiment, almost embarrassingly complete. Brown's patrol counted the 11 airframes individually, noted the position of each, and observed the daily routine of the ground crews. The Pucarás were started and run for engine checks shortly after first light. The Turbo-Mentors flew armed reconnaissance sorties in pairs during the morning, recovering before midday. The Skyvan made one supply run to Stanley each afternoon, weather permitting. The crews returned to the settlement buildings at last light, and no aircraft remained, crewed or ready for immediate launch during the hours of darkness. Captain Brown's hand-drawn sketch maps, copies of which survive in the regimental archive at the Imperial War Museum's Duxford site, mark the position of each aircraft to within 15 meters. The Pucarás occupied the eastern half of the dispersal, the Turbo-Mentors the western half, and the Skyvan sat detached to the south of the strip near the fuel dump. Brown also identified the 2 mortar pits, the single anti-aircraft position fitted with twin 20mm Rheinmetall cannon at the strip's eastern end, and the locations of the 4 buildings used for accommodation and stores. Critically, the patrol observed no electronic emissions consistent with a fire control radar. The garrison possessed no surface-to-air missile capability of any kind. The defense rested entirely on the twin 20mm piece, the small arms of the Buzo Tactical Platoon, and the 2 81mm mortars. For an attacking force willing to accept the risks of a night assault from the seaward flank, the position was, in the bleak phrase used in Brown's final patrol report, soft. The assault force lifted from Hermes at 0600 Zulu on the 14th of May, which on Falklands local time placed the helicopters airborne at approximately 2200 the same evening. The carrier had closed to within 75 nautical miles of the objective, a position that exposed her to potential air attack from the mainland, but reduced the fuel margin of the Sea Kings to a manageable figure. 3 Mark IVs of 8. 4-6 Naval Air Squadron, again under Lieutenant Commander Thornwell, lifted the 45 men of the assault force together with the squadron headquarters and the naval gunfire support team. The flight ran for 55 minutes at 100 feet, navigating by Decker and by Thornwell's reading of the Dead Reckoning plot. The landing zone lay some 6 kilometres west of the airfield, on a stretch of flat peat above the cove at Phillips Point. Brown's reconnaissance patrol, which had marked the site with infrared silume sticks visible only through the night vision goggles fitted to the Sea King pilots, guided the 3 helicopters into a tight cluster landing. The assault force was on the ground by 2300 local, with the helicopters lifting clear within 90 seconds of the last man's boots touching the ground. The approach march to the airfield consumed nearly 3 hours. The men moved in single file across the broken peat, each carrying between 40 and 60 pounds of equipment, depending on his role within the assault. Mountain Troop, designated as the assault element, carried the demolition stores in addition to their personal weapons and ammunition. Boat Troop provided the perimeter security and the casualty evacuation party. The Naval Gunfire Support Team, drawn from 148 Battery of 29 Commando Regiment Royal Artillery, carried the man-portable forward observers equipment and the cipher pads necessary to call fire from HMS Glamorgan, then standing 5 miles offshore. Glamorgan was a County-class guided missile destroyer commissioned in 1966, displacing 6,200 tons and mounting 2 Mark VI twin 4.5-inch gun turrets in super-firing positions forward of the bridge. Her gunnery had been calibrated against a target raft 3 days earlier, and the gunnery officer, Lieutenant Commander Ian Inskip, had reduced the dispersion of his forward turret to figures that satisfied even the exacting standards of the Royal Artillery observers embarked for the operation. The 2 81mm mortars deployed by the squadron support party provided the close-in indirect fire capability, sighted some 600 meters west of the airfield in a shallow depression that masked their muzzle flash from the Argentine observation posts. The first round, a 4.5-inch high-explosive shell from Glamorgan's A turret, fell on the eastern end of the strip at 0735 Zulu on the 15th of May, which placed the time of attack at approximately 3:35 in the morning local time. The shell detonated within 50 meters of the twin 20mm anti-aircraft position, and the second round, falling 30 seconds later, eliminated the gun and its 3-man crew. The destroyer's gunfire then walked westwards along the strip in a slow, deliberate sequence, the explosions providing both the suppression of the Argentine garrison and the audible signal for the mortar party to begin its own bombardment. The mortar bombs, fired in salvos of 2 from each tube at 15-second intervals, dropped onto the settlement buildings and the 2 Argentine observation posts that Brown's reconnaissance had identified. Within 4 minutes of the first naval gunfire round, Mountain Troop crossed the start line, a low stone wall some 200 meters east of the dispersal. The aircraft, illuminated by the burning fuel of the destroyed 20mm position, stood as Brown's sketches had drawn them. Captain Hamilton's Mountain Troop split into pairs at the start line. Each pair allocated 2 aircraft and the demolition stores required to destroy them. The procedure had been rehearsed on the flight deck of Hermes during the afternoon of the 13th, using chalk outlines to represent the dispersal and stopwatches to measure the time taken to place charges and withdraw. The rehearsed figure was 90 seconds per airframe. The figure achieved on Pebble Island, by the recollection of the troop sergeant given to the regimental historian some years afterwards, ran closer to 2 minutes, the difference accounted for by the broken ground, and the necessity of moving under fire from the surviving Argentine positions to the south of the strip. The standard charge consisted of 2 pounds of PE4 plastic explosive, manufactured at the Royal Ordnance Factory at Bridgewater in Somerset, primed with a number 27 detonator and a 30-second time delay fuse. The charge was placed against the engine cowling of each aircraft on the inboard side, where the weight of the explosive would distort the wing route and render any subsequent recovery uneconomic. Where time permitted, a secondary charge of 1 pound was placed in the cockpit against the instrument panel, ensuring that even if the engine charge failed to ignite the aviation kerosene in the wing tanks, the airframe itself would be reduced to scrap. The first aircraft destroyed was a Pucarás at the eastern end of the dispersal, its registration A515, visible in post-action photography taken by the Royal Marines Brigade reconnaissance party that occupied the strip 3 weeks later. The charge detonated at approximately 0742 Zulu, and the explosion ignited the centerline fuel tank of the aircraft. The fireball illuminated the entire dispersal and provided the assault force with sufficient light to identify the remaining airframes without recourse to torches or flares. The second, third, and fourth Pucarás were destroyed in rapid succession, each charge timed to detonate within 15 seconds of its predecessor. By the time the fifth Pucarás was charged, the Argentine garrison had begun to return aim fire from the buildings of the settlement and from a hastily occupied position behind the fuel dump. Captain Hamilton ordered the remainder of the troop to use the 84mm Carl Gustaf recoilless rifle, of which the assault force carried 2 examples against any aircraft that could not be reached safely on foot. The Carl Gustaf, firing the high-explosive anti-tank round, was capable of reducing a Pucarás to wreckage with a single hit at 150 meters, and the weapon accounted for 2 of the airframes during the closing phase of the engagement. The Turbo-Mentors, lighter aircraft of fixed undercarriage construction with single Pratt & Whitney PT-6A engines, presented a simpler demolition problem. Their fuel capacity was lower, their fuselage construction less robust, and the placement of a single charge against the engine compartment was generally sufficient to render the airframe unrecoverable. All 4 Turbo-Mentors were destroyed within 12 minutes of the assault commencing. The Skyvan, parked detached to the south of the strip, was reached by a 4-man party led by the troop sergeant and dispatched with 2 pound charges placed against each of its 2 Garrett TPE 331 engines. The single Argentine fatality of the engagement occurred during this phase. A Buzo Táctico Marine, Teniente de Corbeta Giacchino's section runner, was killed by a fragment from one of the aircraft demolitions as he attempted to engage the Skyvan demolition party from the cover of a peat bank some 40 meters distant. 2 members of the assault force sustained minor wounds from mortar fragments, neither serious enough to require evacuation by stretcher. Captain Esteban's signal to the Comando de la Aviación Naval at Puerto Belgrano was transmitted at approximately 0900 Zulu on the 15th of May, some 45 minutes after the last Sea King had lifted the assault force clear of Pebble Island. The signal, a copy of which entered the Argentine archives following the post-war Rattenbach Commission inquiry, opened with the formal acknowledgement of material loss and proceeded through a damage assessment that even Esteban's superiors recognized as understated. 6 Pucarás of Grupo de Ataque 3 destroyed. 4 T-34C Turbo-Mentors of the 1st Naval Air Attack Squadron destroyed. 1 Skyvan of the Naval Aviation Transport Flight destroyed. 11 aircraft, the entirety of the airfield's flying establishment. The casualty figures returned by Esteban listed 1 killed and 3 wounded among the Buzo Táctico detachment, with no losses among the Naval Aviation ground crews who had remained in the settlement buildings throughout the engagement. The disparity between the destruction wrought upon the airframes and the modest harm inflicted upon the garrison itself produced, in the days that followed, a sustained crisis of confidence within the Argentine command structure. The Buzo Táctico had been promoted in pre-war propaganda as the equal of any special operations formation in the Western world. The reality of their performance against 45 British troopers, operating at the end of a logistical chain stretching 8,000 miles to the United Kingdom, was difficult to reconcile with that claim. The signal traffic that followed Esteban's initial report, intercepted at GCHQ Cheltenham, and distributed within the Joint Intelligence Committee circulation list as part of the daily Falklands summary, revealed an immediate reassessment of perimeter security across the Argentine garrison. At Goose Green, where Vice Commodoro Wilson Pedroso commanded the garrison, and where a forward operating strip held a further detachment of Pucarás from Grupo de Ataque 13, the response was a wholesale revision of the night defensive routine. Standing patrols were doubled. The dispersal of aircraft was widened to 30 meters between airframes on the explicit instruction of the Argentine Air Force Inspector General, and revetments of earth-filled ammunition boxes were constructed around the most valuable airframes within 72 hours of the Pebble Island raid. At Puerto Argentino itself, where General Mario Menendez maintained his headquarters in the government house requisitioned from Sir Rex Hunt on the 2nd of April, the response was more complicated. Menendez had no jurisdiction over the naval aviation assets, which answered through a separate chain of command to Admiral Jorge Anaya in Buenos Aires. The general's principal concern was the implication of the raid for his own ground defences. If a force of British special troops could land undetected on West Falkland, conduct a deliberate attack against a defended airfield, and withdraw without serious loss, the eastern beaches around Stanley were demonstrably vulnerable to a similar operation. Menendez ordered the redeployment of 2 companies of the Fifth Marine Infantry Battalion, originally positioned in reserve south of Stanley, to coastal defensive positions at Berkeley Sound and Port Salvador. The redeployment, conducted between the 16th and the 18th of May, drew these troops away from the main defensive ring around the capital and contributed materially to the difficulties the Argentine garrison would face when the principal British landings occurred at San Carlos rather than at the eastern beaches. The Pebble Island raid had thus achieved a strategic deception effect that exceeded its tactical objective. The destruction of 11 aircraft was the headline result. The diversion of 2 marine companies and the broader paralysis of Argentine defensive planning was the deeper consequence. The principal British landings at San Carlos Water commenced at 0400 Zulu on the 21st of May, 6 days after the destruction of the Pebble Island airfield. 3 Commando Brigade, comprising 40 Commando, 42 Commando, and 45 Commando Royal Marines, together with the 2nd and 3rd Battalions of the Parachute Regiment, came ashore from the assault ships HMS Fearless and HMS Intrepid, and from the converted ferries Norland and Canberra. The amphibious operating area, designated by the planners at Northwood as Blue Beach, Red Beach, and Green Beach, lay some 110 kilometers east of Pebble Island across Falkland Sound. The absence of the Pebble Island Pucará flight from the order of battle of the Argentine air component was, in the assessment of the post-war Ministry of Defense study commissioned by the Director of Defense Operational Analysis, a material factor in the survival of the amphibious force during the critical first 48 hours ashore. The 6 Pucarás, destroyed on the 15th of May, had represented roughly 1/4 of the total ground attack capability available to the Argentine forces in the islands. Their reaction time to a landing in San Carlos Water, calculated from startup at Pebble Island to weapons release over the anchorage, would have been approximately 25 minutes. The corresponding figure from Stanley, where the surviving Pucará detachment was based, was 45 minutes, the difference accounted for by the longer transit and the requirement to refuel at Goose Green for any sustained operation. The mathematics of close air support are unforgiving. A Pucará carrying 2 Mark 81 bombs and a full load of 7.62 mm ammunition for its centerline gun pod could conduct 3 attack runs over the anchorage before exhausting its ordnance. 6 aircraft operating from Pebble Island, generating perhaps 2 sorties each during the daylight hours of the 21st of May, would have produced 36 attack runs against an amphibious force concentrated within an area of water measuring some 3 nautical miles by 1. The destruction of those aircraft on the strip at Pebble Island removed that threat from the calculation entirely. The losses suffered by the British amphibious force during the San Carlos landings were grievous enough as the actual record stands. HMS Ardent, struck by bombs from Argentine Air Force Skyhawks operating from the mainland, was abandoned and sank on the evening of the 21st of May, with 22 of her ship's company killed. HMS Antelope was lost to delayed action bomb damage on the 23rd. HMS Coventry and the merchant vessel Atlantic Conveyor followed on the 25th. The Type 21 frigate HMS Argonaut and the Type 42 destroyer HMS Antrim sustained serious damage from unexploded ordnance. Whether the additional weight of attack from a Pebble Island Pucará flight would have produced the loss of a fully laden landing ship, logistic. With the consequent loss of perhaps 800 troops and the equipment of a battalion combat team, is a question that the historical record cannot answer with certainty. The British planners at Northwood and aboard Hermes considered the risk sufficient to commit 45 men of D Squadron, 22nd Special Air Service Regiment, to the destruction of those aircraft on the night of the 14th of May. The raid stands in the regimental history of the Special Air Service alongside the Western Desert operations of David Stirling's original L Detachment in 1941 and 42. The parallel was drawn explicitly by Brigadier de la Billière in his after-action report submitted to the Chief of the Defence Staff on the 20th of June, 1982, the day after the Argentine surrender at Stanley.